Hello out there. Welcome to Wake Up to the Bible. I'm Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with my father, Dr. Mark Kaplan, and together we're going through the books of the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, over the course of this year, reading a little segment every day. So follow along with us. You'll get through all of Genesis and Deuteronomy. Today we're going to be reading from chapter 22 of Genesis, and I'll be reading from the Robert Alter translation. And it happened after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham! And he said, Here I am. And he said, Take, pray, your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac, and go forth to the land of Moriah, and offer him up as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall say to you. And Abraham rose early in the morning, and saddled his donkey, and took his two lads with him, and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the offering, and rose, and went to the place that God had said to him. On the third day Abraham raised his eyes, and saw the place from afar. And Abraham said to his lads, Sit you here with the donkey, and let me and the lad walk ahead, and let us worship and return to you. And Abraham took the wood for the offering, and put it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the cleaver, and the two of them went together. And Isaac said to Abraham his father, Father! And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Here is the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the offering? And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for the offering, my son. And the two of them went together. And they came to the place that God had said to him. And Abraham built there an altar, and laid out the wood, and bound Isaac his son, and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham reached out his hand, and took the cleaver to slaughter his son. And the Lord's messenger called out to him from the heavens, and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not reach out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, and you have not held back your son, your only one, from me. And Abraham raised his eyes and saw, and look, a ram was caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram, and offered him up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Yireh, as is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord there is sight. And the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham once again from the heavens, and he said, By my own self I swear, declares the Lord, that because you have done this thing, and have not held back your son, your only one, I will greatly bless you, and will greatly multiply your seed, as the stars in the heavens, and as the sand on the shore of the sea, and your seed shall take hold of its enemy's gate. And all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed, because you have listened to my voice. And Abraham returned to his lads, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelled in Beersheba. And it happened after these things that it was told to Abraham, saying, Look, Milcah too has borne sons to Nahor your brother. Uz his firstborn, and Buz his brother, and Kemuel the father of Aram, and Chesed, and Hazo, and Pildash, and Jildoth, and Bethuel begot Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. And his concubine, whose name was Reumah, she too gave birth to Tebah, and to Gam, and to Tahash, and to Makkah. All right, so this is a very troublesome passage for a lot of people because of the specific instructions that God gave Abraham. You might as well kick us off with some thoughts there.
Well, I asked my son for permission to kind of tie up some loose ends before we get to Genesis 22. So, with your permission, I want to go back over some background. When the scribes copied the Hebrew Bible, you can check a Hebrew Bible. Some letters are written large and some are written small, and people speculate as to why. In the beginning begins with a large bet, and the word bet means house. So you could speculate that maybe that large bet there looks all the way forward to the end of the story, to the New Jerusalem, where God creates the universe and then he recreates it to dwell with resurrected human beings, to tabernacle with them. And later on in Genesis 2, and I believe verse 4, it talks about when they were created. This is the story of, of creation when they were created. And there you have a letter Hey in the middle of that word, which is written small. And Hey is used by Hebrew speakers as an abbreviation for God's name, YHWH. So you could say perhaps the concept there is that God, in creating the universe, in effect humbled himself. He kind of limited himself, going from his lofty position to create a universe so he could, to share eternity with others. That's just some concepts you might, think about. As we go along now, I want to go to Genesis 14. There we see Abram is called Abram the Hebrew. He's and It's true he's a descendant of Eber, but there's more to it than that. Calling him Abram the Hebrew is like saying he's Abram from the other side, Abram the one who crossed over. And the idea is that he came from the other side of the Euphrates River and then came over into the land of Canaan. So he was an Ivri. He was one who had crossed over. And you could look at the crossing of the Euphrates in a way as a type of baptism. And if you study the history of Ur, you'll find that when Abraham was growing up in Ur, it was a very important city. And then God evidently took him out of there shortly before the fall of Ur, as the Elamites came and conquered it. So that's kind of something you can put together from studying the history of Ur, and it's kind of like what very likely happened to the Israelites when they left Egypt. They left Egypt, and then as a result of probably of the plagues and the weakening of the country, depending on how you understand the chronology, there was an invasion of Egypt of non-Egyptians who for a time ruled the country. So kind of a parallel there. Now, after a while, the term Hebrew came to be associated with those who worshipped Yahweh, those who worshiped the true God. And so back in the book of Jonah, Jonah says, I am a Hebrew and I worship, Yahweh. I worship the true God, the God of the heavens and the earth. You can look that up, Genesis 1:14. Also in Genesis 14, it talks about the rescue of Lot. And I made a mistake in saying Josephus had the idea that Abraham took Eliezer because his name equals 318. No, Josephus records the account as you have it in the Bible, but he kind of adds that the Abraham's success was to some degree based on the element of surprise. He also thinks that some of the soldiers of the enemy forces were drunk and fled. You can look that up in Josephus. But what's interesting is that the number 318 does equal the name Eliezer, and Eliezer can be translated, my God is a help, or God is a help. And that certainly applies to Genesis 14 and Abraham rescuing Lot with a smaller force than what he had to deal with. Now, as we continue on, I also wanted to mention that in Genesis 20 and verse 13, you have an unusual passage. Normally, of course, you talk about God, Elohim, and there's only one God. So Elohim says, he does, whatever he creates, it is third person singular. When you talk about foreign gods, then you talk about the plural, the gods that can't do this or can't do that, you know. But it's interesting in Genesis 20:13. Maybe could you look at how Alter translates that? Because this is a case where Abraham is talking to a pagan ruler, and you have Elohim with a plural verb. And if you'd look and see how Alter translates that.
He translates it, and it happened when the gods made me a wanderer. That's how he translates it.
He doesn't. I don't know why he has to have the there, because it's just Elohim in the Hebrew. But so Abraham was using the term Elohim kind of loosely here, speaking to a pagan. In one sense, God and the angelic beings are, in a loose sense, Elohim. Elohim could be used in a general sense about the spirit realm. It could also even be used at times about the powerful people on earth, those who determine, who make judgments, life and death judgments. So here he's using Elohim in a kind of loose sense as he's talking to this pagan. In other words, like powers directed me, or God's directed me, and he's, as I said, speaking in terms that maybe this pagan could understand. But there's also another interpretation that I found interesting when he said God caused me to wander, and he used the wander in the plural. It's a way of saying I've been going from here to there to there to there. That's kind of another way to understand it. So hopefully those are points of interest that I hadn't covered before. Now, I want to say just one thing about Genesis 22 before Daniel chimes in. I like Alter's translation because it is literal, where he says, God will provide the offering, my son. That's actually true because God, the son was going to be the offering. So if you look at the original Hebrew, that's how Alter translates it. So Abraham was telling him the truth. But on the other hand, Abraham did this willingly, and why didn't he argue about it when God was going to destroy Sodom? He told his men, "We're coming back," and if with my son's permission, I want to go to Hebrews 11, and then let Daniel have his say. So sorry to take up so much time, but I want to go to
That's good.
Hebrews 11, and evidently this was a tradition among Jews of the first century. This epistle was written to evidently a predominantly Jewish congregation, perhaps in Alexandria, but I'm in Hebrews 11:17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, "In Isaac your seed shall be called," concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. So Abraham perhaps knew that he was acting out what God would ultimately do. We don't know everything that Abraham knew, and maybe he knew that he was in effect acting out what God would ultimately do, and so he had the faith that if he actually literally took the life of Isaac, that Isaac would be resurrected. So I think we should keep in mind this statement in Hebrews because whoever wrote it, it seems that it wasn't necessarily a controversial idea in those days. It was something that evidently was understood, or at least whoever wrote it here wrote it rather authoritatively.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to take a step back just a little bit because I do think that obviously symbolism, the Christology of this whole account is blatant, but I do think sometimes people get so wrapped up into it they kind of miss the initial narrative, which is this is a story about you have this character, and the whole time the character has said what they want is children. Abraham is incredibly concerned with um his legacy, right? Because he has wealth, that's not a concern. He has Sarah, he has, a relationship. What he's concerned about seems to be legacy, right? And to my dad's point, what this test is really about is, are you willing to lay it all on the line? Are you willing to go with this plan that seems completely counterintuitive, knowing that I actually have promised you that what you have desired is actually going to happen? But because this is such a humanistically counterintuitive way, because obviously if the person that you thought was promised was dead, how's that going to happen? For you to actually be willing to commit to going to a plan like that is a tremendous amount of faith, just as a person. And I really feel like I think that sometimes gets a little bit lost because people are just thinking, oh, he's going through the motions to be a type of Christ. And I'm not saying that all of that, analogy isn't there and it's a beautiful picture, but just the person in the story is having to go through all of these motions. And to my dad's point, where the New Testament clears it up, there's at least a way that he could speculate as how God could have worked it out. But the important thing is that he did believe that God was going to work it out. He did not think this was the end of the story. This was a step, this was a counterintuitive step, but it was a step he was willing to take because of the faith in God, and that's to me the beautiful element of this story.
God did not finally require him to literally do it, And later on, of course, God prohibits such action, very strongly condemns it. So from Genesis 22, we should learn that no, that kind of thing is wrong, and yet that kind of thing was quite common in ancient times, the sacrifice of children. So it's clearly prohibited in the scripture, and even in this case, where God supposedly asks of it, He finally says no. I don't, this was a test, but I don't want you to do it.
Right. It is interesting, though, to your point about pushing back. You have Abraham pushing back in for Sodom, and then you eventually will have like Peter pushing back about the vision of the unclean meats. But this is something that does seem like you said, this is something eventually God is going to ban as a practice. But yet Abraham doesn't say, "Well, far be it from you to make me do this." So there's different things you can speculate. Either that principle just hadn't been relayed to Abraham yet, and so he had seen other people doing it, and he knew that this was the God, the God, not just a God, and so he could cause Isaac to resurrect, or there would be some process. Or perhaps because of the specifics of the situation that we just don't know, he realized that this was an exception to that sort of principle. I don't know, but it does make you wonder. Now, there's some other interesting things that come up that are a little bit challenging, like when it says, "Take your son, your only one whom you love, and go," because obviously he has at least two, right? So what some people have said is that this is kind of whittling it down. So it starts with "take your son," and then it's "your only one that you love," and then it even goes all the way down to Isaac because he has more than one son and he actually does love them both. So it's just narrowing it down to who it is. It's kind of dramatic. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, Isaac was the one through whom the covenant would pass. So Isaac was an essential part of the plan that God revealed to Abraham way back in Genesis 12. It's also interesting. Abraham rose early in the morning to do it. He was zealous about doing it. It is interesting.
And again, you have the early in the morning being part of salvation with other things that we've talked about in this program. Now, obviously, you have all these different symbols, right? You have a donkey, you have even the splitting wood from the offering. I'm picturing like pieces of wood getting split. And when you think of the classic cross, you have that kind of symbolism going on. Of course, it's a very interesting detail to put in there, right? It's definitely from a authorial perspective. It's very ominous. It's like you split wood for the offering. You're just picturing, this graphic image. Um, and one other thing I will say is that I'm inclined to believe that Isaac was much older than how he's usually pictured. We're going to talk about the marriage of Isaac in our upcoming episodes, and he's fairly old when that happens. So there's a big gap, and so you have a lot of time in which this could have taken place. But he could have been a fully grown adult. He could have even been in his 30s, based on what I see in this account. What do you think?
Well, the Jewish tradition has him as 37. That may be a little bit old, but he very possibly was a young adult at this time. Um, I wanted to mention also that you have a reference to the third day, um, which also reminds us of the resurrection account in the New Testament. And
Mhm.
also the
Verse
Mount,
4.
also Mount Moriah ultimately becomes the Temple Mount
Mhm.
in the future. Uh, and we see that Isaac, figuratively, he's as good as dead, but he's in effect resurrected in a figurative sense. But then we see the ram substitutes for Isaac. So again, we have typology here. The ram is a type of Christ in that rather than killing Isaac, he kills the ram. And the ram is caught on the thicket by its horn. And this makes, in Jewish tradition, the shofar very significant, the ram's horn.
Robert Alter pointed out that with the weapon he's holding, that it's an unusual word. It's not the typical word for knife, and that's why he translates it as cleaver because he feels like the account is really trying to get across that that violent language that this is not a knife tool. This is a butcher knife, and it's really trying to get that across. Um, yeah, it is interesting because literally nothing seems to happen to Isaac at all. I mean, he gets bound up, but like there's no physical harm that takes place even in the slightest. And I think that is something that we need to remember. I mean, I know probably a lot of people who listen to this aren't into such things, but people do like to sometimes symbolize the sacrifice or try to go through the motions and maybe even hurt themselves a little bit to feel what that's like. And that's just very, to me, anti-biblical. That's not the point. And even in this situation where you have this really close typology, you have Isaac not being physically harmed. So I think that is something we have to keep in mind, that we don't actually have to experience that physical harm in order to understand the point of what happened with the ministry of Jesus Christ.
Of course, if Isaac were younger, it would be easier for Abraham to carry this out. If he's older, then he would have to be willing to go along. So that's also interesting. When later on we see the angel speaking. Well, before we get there, the word alter is quite literal when he translates the verb to see. Most of your translations say the eternal will provide, and we have that kind of language in English. We say see to this, meaning go ahead and provide, and pay attention and do it. So the verb is to see, but often the implication is God will see, meaning He will deal with it. So it's translated in many translations, God will provide. But as I said, alter was quite literal with the verb to see, and evidently a proverb developed from this account. Then, if we go to the angel of the Lord, in your translation, if you have an English translation, it capitalizes it because it would seem that this is again a theophany, as with Hagar, that God, in effect, becomes his own messenger, the uncreated angel. This is the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, because when you read what the angel says, it seems God himself is talking. So at least that's an option, that this angel of the Lord might be the Logos, God himself as his own messenger.
When you see what Abraham called the place too, you could get that impression too. It's it seems like a direct divine encounter, not necessarily angelic one, perhaps.
Now, from my youth, I was taught something interesting about the end of chapter 22. Here, Abraham has had a very unusual life, and he's promised all these descendants, yet he only has, as my son pointed out, so far 2 children. Meantime, his brother, life goes on normally.
Mhm.
God isn't working with his brother in the same way as he is with him. So his brother is having all these kids and, has a more normal life. And so Abraham could complain, but then he could realize, well, no, God is working with me in a way he's not working with my brother. And of course, Rebecca is mentioned here because of her significance later on.
Yep. Yeah, it's setting the stage for more to come. There was something else I was looking at. Oh, um, one thing that I think is a little bit that can be a little bit challenging is where you have God speaking and he says, because you have done this, I will do this for you. And some people get really triggered by things like that because they want the relationship with God to be so almost passive. And it's a challenge because the idea of like earning your own salvation, all of that, really troubles people. Like how do you marry the salvation works puzzle? And I will say we're probably not going to talk about it as much through this, but when we get through the epistles, we sure will. So that's a little plug for our epistles podcast that we will be doing. So yeah, for those of you who struggle with what this could mean, these verses are called out by Paul as well. So or whoever the author of Hebrews was. So we'll get to it because yes, it is interesting and it is something not to just push away like some people kind of do, in my opinion, and take the faith works argument way too far. Anyway, any other thoughts about this chapter?
Faith without works is dead.
You heard it here first. Well, not first. It's in James, but yes. All right. So yes, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, talk to your friends, get the word out. We are going through the books of the law. This is a good year to do so. And yeah, we'll see you tomorrow.